There is a layer of rock underneath the mountains of eastern Kentucky that most people never think about. It sits below the topsoil and the red clay and the coal seams, and it's made of limestone, ancient ocean floor compressed into stone over 300 million years. And limestone does something that most rock doesn't do. It cracks, it fractures, it dissolves along its own fault lines and creates channels and pockets and hidden rivers that move water underground in ways that have nothing to do with what's happening on the surface. You can be standing in a drought so bad the creeks have turned to dust, and 20 feet below your boots, there's water moving through stone that hasn't stopped flowing since before your grandparents were born. Most people in 1934 didn't know that, but a girl in Wolfe County, Kentucky did. And she dug for it every single day for a year while everyone around her thought she was losing her mind. Her name was Willa Back. She was the youngest of 5 children and the only girl, and in the summer of 1933 she started digging a hole behind her family's cabin on Stillwater Branch with a short-handled spade that had a cracked handle wrapped in twine. Nobody asked her to dig it. Nobody told her to. Her brother Harlan, who had taken over the family since their father died in a mine rockfall 2 years earlier, told her to stop wasting her time and go haul water from the creek like everyone else. Her other brothers ignored her. The neighbors, when they noticed at all, shook their heads and said the Back girl had gone soft in the brain, probably from the grief. Willa didn't explain. She wasn't much for talking. She just dug. Now, to understand why Willa started digging, you need to know about Mr. Amos Sloan. Amos was a retired well digger who lived at the mouth of the hollow in a cabin built directly over a hand-dug well he had sunk 40 years ago. That well had never gone dry. Not in the drought of 1901, not in the drought of 1925, not ever. While every other well on Stillwater Branch dropped to mud and then to nothing, Amos Sloan's well held steady at 4 feet of clear cold water year after year. People thought he was lucky. Amos knew it wasn't luck. He had spent his life digging wells, and over those decades he had learned to read the land the way some people read the Bible, with patience and attention and the understanding that the truth was always deeper than the surface. He knew where the limestone fractured. He knew where the water tables sat. He knew that the spot where his cabin stood was directly above a fracture zone in the limestone shelf where groundwater collected and moved, and that's why he built there. Willa's father, before he died, had been one of the few people who listened to Amos. He'd asked the old man where to dig a well on the back property, and Amos had walked the land and found the spot. Behind the cabin, on the slope where the red clay met a shelf of gray limestone that broke through the surface like a bone through skin. "Dig there," Amos told him. "Go straight down through the clay. When you hit the limestone, keep going. You'll want to quit when you hit stone, but don't. Go through it. There's water underneath." Willa's father died before he could dig. But Willa had been standing there when Amos pointed, and she remembered. She started in July of 1933. The clay was hard as brick from the heat, and her spade was dull, and she was 14 years old and weighed 90 pounds and had arms like rope. The first day she dug maybe 8 inches. The second day she dug 6. The third day she bent the spade blade on a root thick as her wrist and had to hammer it straight on a rock before she could keep going. By the end of the first week, she had a hole 3 feet deep and 4 feet across, and blisters on both palms that had broken and bled and broken again. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from an old flour sack and kept going. The cloth turned brown with clay and red with blood, and she changed it twice a day and kept going. The heat was the worst part of those first weeks. July in a Kentucky hollow is like working inside a mouth. Hot, wet, no air moving. The red clay baked hard by midday, and the spade rang off it like she was hitting brick. She learned to dig in the early morning when the ground was cooler and had a little give, and again in the evening when the shadow of the ridge reached the cabin. The middle of the day she spent on house chores and garden work, the way Harlan expected. Nobody paid her any mind at first. People had their own problems. The mine at Seco had laid off another 40 men that month, and families were already starting to worry about winter. A girl digging a hole behind a cabin wasn't worth noticing. Harlan noticed, though. He came out on the 7th day and stood at the edge of the hole with his arms crossed. "What are you doing?" "Digging." "I can see that. What for?" "Water." Harlan looked at the hole, looked at Willa, looked at the creek, which was still running in July, and shook his head. "The creek's right there. 40 yards. You're digging a hole for water we already have." Willa said nothing. She kept digging. "You're wasting daylight," Harlan said. "Get to the garden." She went to the garden. She weeded and watered and hauled buckets from the creek until dark. And the next morning before dawn, she was back at the hole. This is how it went for months. Willa worked the garden and the house during the day and dug before sunrise and after sunset. She dug by feel in the dark, the sound of the spade biting clay the only thing she could hear besides the creek and the whippoorwills. She dug in rain and actually preferred it, because the rain softened the clay and she could pull up twice as much per hour. She dug when her shoulders ached so bad she couldn't lift her arms above her head, and she had to dig underhand, scraping the clay upward. August was 4 feet. September, 5 feet. The hole was deep enough now that she needed a rope and bucket to haul the clay out. She rigged a pulley from a forked branch, and a wheel she pulled off a broken spinning jenny she found in the collapsed barn, filled the bucket at the bottom, climbed out, hauled it up, dumped it, lowered it back down, climbed back in. Over and over, 100 times a day. The neighbor women started talking. Mabel Turner told her sister-in-law that the back girl was touched, which was the polite way of saying crazy. Doris Combs said it was the grief of losing her daddy still working its way out. Ruth Johnson, who had 3 babies and no time for gossip, said nothing but watched from her porch with something that might have been curiosity. Harlan's other brothers, Clay, Emmett, and Boyd, had opinions too. Clay said she was ruining good ground that could have been a garden. Emmett said she was going to hit a gas pocket and blow herself to kingdom come. Boyd, the quiet one, just watched the pile of red clay growing beside the hole and said, "She sure is stubborn," which in the Back family was the closest thing to a compliment anyone ever got. By October, she was 6 feet deep, and she hit limestone. The spade bounced off the rock like she'd hit iron. The shock ran up through the handle and into her wrists and shoulders, and she knew, in that instant, that everything she'd done so far, 3 months of digging through clay in the heat and the rain and the dark, had been the easy part. Clay moves when you push it. Stone doesn't. She stood at the bottom of her hole looking at gray limestone that had been sitting there since before the dinosaurs, and she had a choice. Quit, or find a way through. She went to see Mr. Sloan. Amos was sitting on his porch in the evening light, so old and bent, he looked like part of the chair. His hands were curled and stiff with arthritis, the fingers of a man who had spent 50 years gripping shovel handles and chisel shafts. "I hit stone," Willa said. Amos nodded like he'd been waiting for her. "How deep?" 6 feet. "That's about right for that spot. Your daddy would have hit it at the same depth. How do I get through it?" Amos thought about this for a while. Then he went inside and came back with a mason's hammer and a set of steel chisels wrapped in oilcloth. "Cut a channel along the grain," he said. "Limestone has a grain like wood. Find it. Follow it. Don't fight the stone. Work with it." "How far do I have to go?" 8 feet. Maybe 10. You'll know when you're close because the stone will start to sweat. It'll feel damp. When you see water on the chisel, you're almost there. And then? Then you'll have water that doesn't care what the weather's doing. If you want to know what happened when Willa hit water, and what the people who called her crazy did when the river went dry, and her hole was the only water left on Stillwater Branch, subscribe to The Hidden Harvest and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because this girl didn't just dig a hole. She dug down to something that had been waiting under that mountain for 300 million years. The winter was the hardest part. November brought the first hard frost, and the clay above the limestone froze solid around the edges of the hole. Willa climbed down every morning into a pit that was cold enough to see her breath, and she worked the chisel with fingers so numb she couldn't feel the handle. Some mornings she had to hold her hands against her stomach under her shirt for 10 minutes before she could grip anything. She cut into the limestone inch by inch, loading the stone chips into a bucket and hauling them up by rope. The hole got deeper and narrower and darker. She worked by candlelight at the bottom, the flame guttering in the cold air that rose from the stone. The candle stubs were precious. She begged them from Amos, who saved his for her, and from the church, where the preacher's wife gave her the ends of the altar candles without asking what they were for. December was brutal. A week of ice storms coated the inside of the hole with a glaze that made the walls slick as glass. She slipped climbing out one morning and fell 4 feet back to the bottom, landing on the limestone hard enough to crack a rib. She wrapped her chest with a strip of cloth and kept working. She didn't tell Harlan. She didn't tell anyone. She just breathed shallow and swung the hammer one-handed until the rib healed enough to swing with 2. Christmas came and went. The Back family had no celebration. There was nothing to celebrate with. Willa ate cornbread and beans and went back to the hole on December 26th and chiseled for 4 hours in a sleeting rain that turned the clay walls to red mud. January was so cold, the creek froze at the edges. Willa broke ice off the rim of the hole every morning before climbing down. The limestone at depth was actually warmer than the surface, one of the things Amos had told her about. "Stone holds heat the way a body holds heat," he said. "The deeper you go, the steadier it gets." He was right. At 9 feet down, the temperature held in the mid-50s, even when the surface was in the teens. By February, she was 10 feet deep. Her hands were a mess. Split knuckles, infected blisters. 2 fingernails she'd lost to missed hammer blows that never grew back right. She'd worn through 3 pairs of shoes and was on her 4th. A pair of cracked brogans she'd pulled off a dead man's donation pile at the church. She'd broken 2 of Amos's chisels and mended them by heating the steel in the cabin fire and hammering the edges flat on a rock. The 3rd chisel was holding, but barely. In March, the chisel came up damp. She stopped, held it close to the candle. The steel was dark with moisture along the cutting edge. She pressed her palm against the stone at the bottom of the hole. Cool, slick, alive with water she couldn't see yet. She cut 2 more inches that day. The stone wept. Dark lines of moisture appeared along the fracture she was following, and the air at the bottom of the hole changed, cooler, heavier, smelling of mineral and deep earth. The next morning, she hit the fracture zone. The chisel punched through a thin shelf of stone and water surged up around it. Not a flood, not a gush, but a steady, determined upwelling of clear, cold groundwater that rose and pooled at the bottom of the hole and just kept coming. She climbed out and stood at the top and watched the water rise. 1 foot, 2 feet. It stopped at 3 feet and held. 3 feet of water, clear as glass, cold enough to make your teeth ache. Fed from a limestone aquifer that had been holding and moving water through fractured stone for longer than anyone in Wolfe County had been alive. Willa sat on the edge of her hole in the March mud, and she didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat there and watched the water and listened to the sound it made. A quiet, steady whisper of stone and water that sounded like breathing. She lined the walls with flat creek stones over the next 2 months. She mortared them with clay mixed with ash, the way Amos taught her. She cut rough steps into the stone on one side, so she could climb down to the water. She built a wooden cover with a hinged lid to keep leaves and animals out. The neighbors saw the cover go on, and some of them came to look. They peered down the hole and saw the water, and most of them said variations of the same thing. Well, that's a lot of work for a puddle. Harlan looked and said nothing, which for Harlan was almost respectful. Then summer came, and with it, the worst drought anyone on Stillwater Branch had ever seen. June was dry, July was worse. By August, the creek that gave the hollow its name had stopped running entirely. The creek bed was nothing but cracked mud and dry stone. The wells started going next. One by one, farm by farm, the water table dropped below the reach of shallow wells, and people pulled up buckets of mud and then buckets of nothing. The Johnson well went dry first, then the Combs, then the Turners. By September, every well on Stillwater Branch was dry or nearly dry, except 2. Amos Sloane's, which held steady as it always had, and Willa Back's. Her hole, her 14-foot hand-dug, hand-chiseled, year-in-the-making cistern, held 3 feet of water through the worst of it. The level dropped to 2 feet in August, and everyone held their breath, but it never went lower. The aquifer kept feeding it. The limestone kept filtering it. The water stayed cold and clean while the world above turned to dust. The first neighbor came with a bucket on a Tuesday in August. It was Mrs. Ruth Johnson, the one who had watched from her porch without saying anything all those months. She had 3 children under 6 and a well that had been dry for 2 weeks. She'd been hauling water from Stillwater Fork, 3 miles each way, twice a day, with a baby on her hip and 2 toddlers stumbling behind her. She was thin as a rail, and her eyes had the flat look of someone running out of hope. She stood at the edge of Willa's cistern and didn't say anything for a long time. She looked down at the water. Clear, still, steady. Just sitting there 3 feet deep while the world above had turned to powder. Then she said, "Can I?" Willa lowered a bucket and handed it to her full. Ruth Johnson stood there holding that bucket of cold, clean water, and her face did something complicated, something between shame and relief and gratitude, and the specific kind of pain that comes from realizing you'd dismissed someone who was trying to save you. She didn't apologize for calling Willa touched. She didn't need to. The water said everything. The next day, Doris Combs came. Then Mabel Turner, the same Mabel Turner who had told everyone the back girl was crazy. Mabel stood at the edge of that cistern and looked down at the water and looked at Willa, and her mouth opened and closed, and nothing came out. She filled her bucket and left, without a word. By the end of the week, there was a line. By the end of the month, Willa's cistern was the primary water source for 9 families, 43 people, and whatever livestock they had left. She organized the hauling with a system that was simple and fair. She set a schedule: 2 buckets per family per day for drinking and cooking. Livestock got 1 bucket every other day. Nobody took more than their share because everybody could see the water level, and everybody knew that if they were greedy, everyone would suffer. Willa never gloated. She never reminded anyone that they'd laughed or shaken their heads or called her crazy. She just stood at the edge of her hole every morning and every evening and lowered the bucket and pulled it up and handed it over, again and again, until everyone had what they needed. Her hands were calloused so thick they looked like leather gloves. Her shoulders were knotted with muscle she hadn't had a year ago, and her face, that thin, sharp face that people used to say, looked blank and strange, had something in it now that wasn't there before. Not pride exactly, something quieter, the look of someone who had found what they were looking for. Harlan stopped commenting on the hole. He helped build a proper wooden platform around the top so people wouldn't slip on the mud. He carried buckets for the families who lived farthest up the hollow. He never said he'd been wrong. But he carried those buckets every single day without being asked. And for Harlan, that was the same thing. Mr. Sloan walked up to see the cistern one evening in September. He moved slow. It took him most of an hour to walk from his cabin at the mouth of the hollow to the back place. He stood at the edge and looked down at the water for a long time. "Your daddy would have been proud," he said. "He told you where to dig," Willa said. "You told me." "I told you where. You did the digging. That's the part that matters." The drought broke in late October with 3 days of rain that turned the hollow into a river of red mud. The creek came back. The wells refilled, slowly. Life on Stillwater Branch went back to something like normal. But something had changed in the hollow that couldn't change back. The people who had watched Willa dig for a year and said nothing, or worse, had seen what that year of digging was worth. They had stood in line at her cistern with empty buckets and full shame, and they had drunk water that came from 14 feet of patience and stubbornness and a dead man's advice and a girl who wouldn't quit. Willa's cistern stayed. People kept coming to it even after their wells recovered, because the water was better, colder, cleaner, filtered through 8 feet of limestone instead of pulled from a shallow clay pocket that could go dry any time the rain stopped. The Johnson children grew up drinking that water. The Combs family carried it home in the same buckets they'd brought in the drought. Even Mabel Turner, who never did apologize for calling Willa touched, came to the cistern every Saturday for the rest of her life for drinking water. Because once you've tasted water that's been filtered through 300 million years of limestone, well, water tastes like mud. Willa maintained the cistern her whole life. She repointed the stone mortar every spring. She cleaned the sediment from the bottom every fall. She replaced the wooden cover twice, once when a falling branch crushed it in a storm, and once when it simply rotted through after 20 years. She deepened it twice, once in 1940 and again after the war, going another 4 feet each time, opening up more of the fracture zone and increasing the flow. And she taught. That was the part that mattered most. She taught 4 other families on Stillwater Branch how to read the limestone the way Amos had taught her, how to look for the outcrops, how to feel for the fractures, how to listen to the stone the way Amos always said you should. She stood over their holes the way Amos had sat on his porch for her, and she answered their questions with the same patience. And when they hit stone and wanted to quit, she told them the same thing Amos told her. Don't stop. The water doesn't care if you're tired. Keep going. By 1950, there were 5 deep cisterns on the hollow, all dug by hand, all tapping the same aquifer, and Stillwater Branch was the only hollow in Wolfe County that never had a water crisis again. Not in 1953, not in 1965, not ever. She lived there until she was 81. She never married. She never left. When people asked why, she said, "I spent a year digging this hole. I'm not leaving it." Amos Sloan died in the winter of 1938 in his cabin at the mouth of the hollow, sitting in the same chair on the same porch, above the same well that never went dry. Willa was the one who found him. She sat with him for a while before she told anyone. Then she went home and sharpened her chisels and went back to work, because that's what Amos would have wanted, and because the water didn't stop moving just because the man who understood it was gone. That's what patience looks like when it's made of stone and water. Subscribe to The Hidden Harvest for more stories about the forgotten knowledge that kept people alive when nothing else could. And tell me in the comments, have you ever done something that everyone thought was pointless until the day it saved you? A girl dug a hole for a year and nobody understood. Then the river went dry and everybody did. There's always water beneath the stone. You just have to be stubborn enough to reach it.